What if the most important years of Jesus' life were never written in the Bible? What if we only know part of the story, while the rest stayed hidden in silence, tucked away in history and faith? The Bible tells us about Jesus at 12 years old, standing in the temple and teaching elders with surprising wisdom. Then the record suddenly stops. The next time we see him, he is 30 years old, baptized, glowing, and ready to start the work that would change the world. But what about those 18 years in between? Did he stay quietly in his hometown, working as a carpenter's son? Or was he somewhere else, following a higher calling? Edgar Cayce, known as the sleeping prophet, said those years were not wasted. They were years of purpose, full of learning and travel across different lands and ancient faiths. Cayce spoke of Jesus not only as a divine figure but as a soul getting ready for the biggest spiritual mission in human history. And to be ready, Cayce said, he needed life experience. In this video, we look at what Cayce said about the lost years of Jesus. Through thousands of trance readings, he described Jesus' path on earth with detail and spiritual insight. Cayce's reading 5749-2 was one of the first to say that Jesus became a master not only through his public ministry but through earlier experiences in many lands. Cayce meant this in a real way. Jesus traveled. According to Cayce, one of the first places he went was India. In the East, he was known not as Jesus but as a bright teacher, learning about compassion, karma, and the inner self. He met sages and holy men, visiting temple after temple, learning with respect. He didn't turn away from their wisdom, he took it in and later used it in his teachings, like the Sermon on the Mount. But his journey didn't end in India. Cayce said Jesus also went to Egypt, not as a visitor but as a student of the sacred mysteries. Egypt still kept old spiritual practices from the temples of Isis and Ra. These were not just rituals but ways to awaken the soul's memory and connect with God's will. In reading 1158-12, Cayce said Jesus went through purification rites in the Great Pyramid. He called it a temple of initiation and said Jesus experienced a kind of death and rebirth, not in body, but in mind and spirit. These were like the mystery schools of old, where students would lie in a stone coffin to awaken their spirit, guided by priests who knew the soul's path after death. This picture of Jesus is very different from the usual one we are taught, but it shows a deeper side of who he became. Cayce said these steps were not a distraction but a key part of his purpose. Each challenge and ceremony shaped him, cleared his spirit, and made him ready. From Egypt, Cayce believed Jesus may have gone to Persia, where Zoroastrian teaching spoke about the fight between light and darkness, personal responsibility, and the hope of a savior to come. These ideas matched the mission growing inside him. Cayce did not give exact maps or dates, but he shared glimpses, Jesus traveling under different names, sometimes recognized by wise people as the one foretold, sometimes unknown except to a few. His travels were not just about moving from place to place. They were about finding the path meant for him. Cayce said that the soul of Jesus had lived many times before, as Enoch, as Melchizedek, even as Adam, and in each life carried parts of divine memory forward. Those missing years were not empty, but sacred parts of a soul remembering itself. By the time Jesus came back to Judea at 30, he wasn't just a man ready to speak. He was someone who had walked ancient paths, honored different visions of God, and brought them together, not as rivals, but as a whole. Think about the weight of that. Think about the silence he held. For 18 years, he lived a life we barely talk about, holding teachings the world had long kept apart. Cayce said his return at 30 was no accident. It marked the end of certain cycles and the start of his mission. He had gathered what mattered, let go of what didn't, and was ready to fulfill the promise his soul made before birth. His baptism by John was not just a symbolic act, it was a moment of complete alignment, where his higher self, the Christ consciousness, and his prepared human body became one. In reading 2067-7, Cayce shared that the voice from heaven, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased," was not only heard by the crowd, but also felt deep inside Jesus, sealing the connection between God and his mission. That moment wasn't about praise, it was about ignition. Cayce also said something that challenges traditional thinking. Jesus was not only showing divine will, he was showing what all souls could become. He was, in Cayce's words, the pattern, not the exception. That means the lost years are more than history, they are a guide for inner growth, service, humility, and remembering who we truly are. This hidden chapter matters because it's not just about where Jesus went, but why he went, and what it means for us today. The silence around these years is not by chance. It shows how we often turn divine figures into statues instead of remembering they walked the same ground we do, faced doubts, and still chose the higher path. The church may not talk much about these years, but the soul feels the gap. Many sense the story is unfinished, that such a great teacher could not have just vanished from age 12 to 30. Cayce confirmed what many have long felt: Jesus didn't disappear. He prepared. He came back not with force, but with presence, a presence shaped in silence, strengthened by ancient wisdom, ready to show that the real temple is within the soul. Even now, the thought that Jesus studied in other lands is often met with silence or pushback, not because it's weak, but because the meaning is huge. If the Son of God looked for truth beyond his homeland, then truth isn't tied to one place, one belief, or one family line. It moves like water, and those who want it must travel far, question deeply, and bow before altars they do not yet know. Cayce's readings didn't try to replace the gospel. They did something else, they filled the gaps with soul memory. In reading 57:49-14, Cayce said Jesus's time in India and Persia was key to his growth, showing that he became the Christ not by birth alone, but through challenges and surrender to divine law. Cayce said the Christ is a consciousness, not just a single person. Jesus became that fully by aligning his mind, body, and spirit with the divine plan. These ideas can be hard to accept, especially for those raised in strict beliefs. But Cayce's words came in prayer, with respect, not ego. And always pointed back to love. A love that does not divide spiritual paths but sees them all as steps toward one source. So what did Jesus truly learn in those silent years? That truth may look different in many places, but it always speaks through the heart. He learned that power without kindness means nothing, and that wisdom without humility turns into pride. Most of all, he learned to remember who he truly was, not just Jesus of Nazareth, but a soul that had walked the earth many times, now ready for the highest calling. Cayce said that even in his youth, Jesus felt the weight of his mission. He had questions, longings, and even fear. Not because he lacked faith, but because he was human. That's what makes his story remarkable, not that he avoided struggle, but that he overcame it through faith, service, and trust in divine timing. When he finally appeared as the master teacher, it wasn't a sudden change. It was the result of many lives and 18 hidden years of preparation. Those forgotten years laid the foundation for everything he would later say and do. The light of Christ wasn't forged in public glory, but in quiet. So what does this mean for us? It means the journey of the soul is long, layered, and sacred. Jesus didn't come to be worshipped for what we are not. He came to remind us of what we are and what we can become. His lost years, as Cayce described, were not wasted, they were sacred ground, a time when a human being was slowly shaped into a vessel for the Christ light. If even he needed a time of silence and learning, we should honor our own seasons of stillness and searching. Many feel stuck in life, as if nothing important is happening. But the quiet years are often when the soul does its deepest work. Jesus wasn't performing miracles in those years. He studied, listened, and served quietly, allowing the divine within him to grow without resistance. He trained in the temples of Egypt and the East, not just to gain knowledge, but to remember his soul's long history, reaching back to ancient incarnations and earlier missions. These were not added for mystery, they were part of the real path. The lost years aren't truly lost, they're hidden under layers of forgetting and tradition. Cayce didn't just share history. He shared a spiritual memory, a reminder that Jesus was the living pattern of what we are all becoming. Enlightenment doesn't arrive in a flash, it comes through long journeys, quiet service, and surrender without reward. So if you feel like you're in a silent chapter of life, know that it might be your preparation, your desert, your temple, or your inner mountain. You're not behind. You're becoming. The same light that fully awakened in Jesus is in you. Cayce's words simply brushed away the dust and invited us to believe it. Maybe that's why the story jumps from age 12 to 30. Not because nothing happened, but because we're meant to walk those years ourselves. And if something in this story feels old and familiar to you, then it has already done its work.